Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A Rare Win-Win, How Reskilling Programs Can Optimize the Nurse Workforce and Financial Outcomes. I'm Erica Spicer Mason with Becker's Healthcare, and on behalf of Becker's, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I'm going to walk through just a few quick housekeeping instructions. First, we'll start today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box that you see on your screen. Second, our session today is being recorded and it'll be available after the event. You can use the same link that you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording. And finally, if at any time you don't see your slides moving or if you're having trouble with the audio, just try refreshing your browser and you can submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have with us two folks from SnapNurse. We have Jeff Richards, the Chief Development and Operating Officer, and Elena Hall, the Chief Quality Officer at SnapNurse. Jeff and Elena, thank you so much again for joining us today, and I will go ahead and turn the floor over to you to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. And thanks to Becker's Healthcare for having us on and giving us a chance to share a little bit about reskilling program that is really, it's Elena Hall's, thesis in her doctorate degree, which we're going to unpack a little bit of that today. And then, what contribution it's making to the current significant workforce shortage in nursing and healthcare. So first, let me just say that I'm super excited to interview our Chief Quality Officer, Elena Hall, as Erica just mentioned. She's got 20 years of nursing experience in leadership, acute care, ambulatory, and in clinical operations overall. She is a certified advanced nurse executive. She is also a fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives and the current president of the Ventura Santa Barbara Association of California Nurse Leaders. Today, we're going to talk a little about her thesis, which is the economic evaluation of clinical reskilling initiatives, the cost effectiveness and vacancy rate. So it's a pretty deep dive into the world of reskilling. And so, number one, welcome, Elena.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Becker's for allowing me to share some of the work I've been doing over the past couple of years and share some lessons learned in this webinar.
Awesome. So I know I've got a list of questions and then we're going to get to audience questions here at the end, but I kind of want to start us off at a pretty high level and some of it intersects with our own company in some ways. And that is with the rise of workforce marketplaces, platform, tech-enabled staffing approaches, how can a strategic approach to clinician reskilling bolster an organization's agility? So a hospital or healthcare system to ensure its financial health by adapting swiftly to changing demands?
That's a great question. So I actually started this journey years ago, just working in the hospital setting and just realizing how challenging it was to get the clinicians skilled in the particular departments I was overseeing, whether it was burn, whether it was ER. There's just such a huge transition when you're trying to get clinicians where they need to go. So you really start with having a really innovative and progressive executive leadership team who's able to think outside the box, right? There's been so many different iterations of reskilling, of transition to practice, of just different models to try to get your staff up and in place. But you have to kind of take all the things we've learned over the years and really put together into a program that focuses on what you really need, not just on theories, not just on things that people just talk about, just kind of tongue in cheek, but how do you make it into an operational program? So when you have a really progressive chief nurse executive, chief medical officer, those are the two people you really have to start with to kind of help lay the groundwork, set the tone for what type of reskilling is needed in the organization. And then also you have to survey your internal staff. Many times you look outside, you look for people who might be willing to come and work in your organization, but you'd be surprised how many of your internal staff would be interested in reskilling, which is part of the foundation of my own research in this particular project, looking at the internal staff, see who has the hunger, the want to learn additional skills, and then actually pairing that with a reskilling program that meets the strategic needs of the organization.
That's a great point about, looking internally first. And I think as, hospitals and healthcare organizations struggle post-pandemic into how they're going to manage their workforce, potentially decrease their dependency on contingent staffing, looking from within, which can be sort of two-pronged, right? Because you can promote an internal culture that keeps those clinicians excited to be there because they want to see those pathways to grow and expand their skill set. So great point. And I think for our financial executives, who I'm sure were cheering when they heard about the second part of this thesis is about cost effectiveness and reducing vacancies, or right along those lines. So all of them, all the healthcare leaders that are on this call and listening, who are living in this world of incredibly tight budgets, how can placing an investment in reskilling transform and be a game changer for them, for their organization?
So part of it is about being structured, right? You hear about this transition to practice and reskilling, and people are trying to do it internally, but many times your internal staff are just inundated with multiple projects, multiple things they have to focus on, whether it's orientation, new grad residencies, and things like that. But when you have a structured reskilling program, you're looking at a way to look at how you are having a fundamental alternative to contingent staffing labor, right? We all know contingent staffing labor is not going to go away anytime soon, but there is a way to mitigate some of the excessive use that we all see that's going on. I'm sure many of the folks watching this webinar are doing lots of work. They may not have as much of a need, but when you are looking at a reskilling program, now you're looking at your internal staff. You're looking internal to your organization, finding out what resources are available, aligning that with your strategy, looking at what type of resources you need, and then actually having a plan mapped out with your HR department, mapped out with your nursing leadership and your physician leadership to determine how do you look within a internal budget, and then maybe supplementing that externally as needed. But right now, many times, because there are so many different whirlwinds going on in your organization, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just say, hey, let's just hire all these external people. And you're not really solving the sustainable problem of keeping a workforce that's entrenched in your organization and ready to work. So there are we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but there's just so many ways to decrease your budget and to laser focus on what your needs and decrease some of that overhead with contingent staffing.
Great point. It's all about budgets and workforce management and balancing the need for internal and external staff, when the latter of which, of course, is contingent and can be flexed up and down, which there's still value in that. Everybody knows that. But to take a deeper dive on the finance side of it, what are those key financial indicators that can be, so for our audience today, that can leave here and say, well, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to invest in this. This seems like a good idea. What are the key financial indicators that can be positively influenced and measured when you implement a transition to practice model alongside clinician reskilling?
Sure. Three things come to mind, and there are three things that are starting to illuminate in my own work that I'm doing, which is turnover, your turnover rate, your retention rate, and your length of stay, right? So when you have nurses, specifically, I'm going to speak to nurses today, who you're having a high turnover rate, you can't keep them in the hospital, even when you're hiring them full time, what's going on? Why are they not being successful? And why are you not successful in keeping them there? And then also just retaining the staff that you currently have. What are ways to, we've all heard the stories that nurses aren't staying more than a couple of years, and many hospitals are seeing 100% turnover rate over a 5-year span. So how do you create innovative ways to make them want to stay, to invest in their professional development? And then also, when you're doing both of those things, you're going to inherently reduce your length of stay, because now you have staff who's been in the department for some months, years at a time. They understand your culture, they understand your physicians, they understand your patient population, and you're going to help collectively drive down that length of stay, because now you know the education that's needed and all the things that you don't necessarily have when you have an influx and outflow of contingent labor that disrupts that flow.
It's a great point. So it's really tracking all of those metrics along the staff that, and when you do get turnover, that you have benchmarks in place. So how long it takes to reskill, how long it takes to gain the institutional knowledge that then translates into cost savings and also better care. So that's a great point. And to this next question, it kind of builds on that. How does the economic impact of clinician reskilling, which you just highlighted, the three measurable statistics that might be top of mind, but how does it contribute to the overall financial health of an organization?
You look at things like patient satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and physician satisfaction. Those are three things that are always top of mind. You kind of hear it in bits and pieces, but when you look at those metrics, you look at, are your patients satisfied? Why are they leaving? Why are they maybe going to the competitor? What are some of the issues that are going on? You're looking at your employee satisfaction scores. What's happening with your employees, not just your frontline employees, but what's happening with your management team. As we're all seeing, the management teams have been decimated because they're having challenges with staffing. And I know probably the big question is, where's all this staff coming from? Where's all this internal staff coming from? Which is something we can talk about a little bit later in this particular webinar. But those are things you have to really think about. How are you keeping those employees satisfied? What are things you're offering that are tangible, not just things you're saying that's giving lip service to what you think may work, kind of hearing their voice and what they want. And then physician satisfaction. Many times, you have your strategic plans, you want to grow service lines, you want to do all these things, but the physicians are frustrated because they don't have enough staff. They don't have staff that understand what they need from them as far as providing that effective patient care and the evidence-based practice needed to have great patient outcomes. And then making sure they're able to keep their flow as far as being able to manage the cases, get patients through the clinics. Just all of those things have to happen from the physician satisfaction part as well. So having a really effective clinician reskilling program focuses on all of those three things all at once.
Love that you're calling out physician satisfaction. So, I mean, in the end, healthcare is a team, and it can't just be something that solely focuses on one part of the team. Where the nurse workforce could significantly benefit from reskilling, there's a huge financial benefit to it, and improving the overall aspects of the team, which of course, that's a very holistic way of approaching it. So this is a great follow-up, is with the constant evolution of medical practices, particularly physician-led, but also sometimes system-owned, how does clinician reskilling ensure that they remain financially competitive?
The first thing that comes to mind to me is service line growth, right? Especially in really competitive markets where you have centers of excellence, where you're recruiting for different types of surgeons or different types of practices that you really want to grow in that particular service line. And one important factor to service line growth is having a really knowledgeable clinical team that's able to support that service line, where when you're bringing in and you're trying to recruit these surgeons or physicians to your organization for service line growth, they know they have a team behind them that's going to help make sure those patients have the best outcomes possible. So you really stay competitive when your patients are happy. They know they're coming to the best organization that offers the best clinical care. And that's why earlier I mentioned you have to have an innovative and progressive executive team, but usually your chief nurse executive and your CMO are tied at the hip. And they're the ones driving a lot of these initiatives, making sure that they're aligned with the service line growth when you're reporting your financials to your internal staff and also to your boards that you represent, that you're reporting to as well.
Such a good point. It's when they aren't tied at the hip, you can get to things like you can get into a vicious cycle versus a virtuous circle where there is collaboration and alignment. It doesn't mean there isn't disagreement between nurse executives and other aspects of administration, but when it's a meaningful collaboration, you're going to get a better outcome. So, and this question kind of builds on that too. So, on the one hand, with the current and sort of ongoing, which doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon, potentially even the next 5 to 10 years, this nurse workforce shortage, opposed or balanced by rapid medical advancements, right? We've got innovation occurring alongside something that requires a different kind of innovation, workforce innovation. So where does clinician reskilling, fit in as an innovative solution for maintaining economic stability?
Yeah, sure. In a world that you're being asked to do more with less, the question is, where do you allocate resources? When you look at your overall organization, regardless of your size, you usually have pockets that you really want to focus on, right? If you're doing like a laser focus, let's say, for example, with one of the one portion of the project I'm working on, they're really trying to work on their length of stay, and they're having a hard time with getting their PICC lines placed, getting people out of the hospital. So as part of that, part of the reskilling is like having that laser focus on what is one thing that can help drive some of those length of stay issues. So being able to train some of the clinical staff on PICC line placement and having those competencies done. Reskilling doesn't have to be broad. It can be focused, laser focused on what are some things that are really causing delays in your organization. And then actually bringing in those experts to provide that education. There's no way you can hire every single clinical expert in your organization. Now, there are some academic medical centers, those large tertiary quaternary facilities that have a lot of those experts on site, but the majority of the healthcare systems, they don't have that. They have a modest nurse education department. At best, sometimes it's very small. It's considered a cost center, so it's not necessarily an investment center where they're investing in those resources. So when you strategically have a clinical reskilling program partnership, it really does help drive those metrics. It can help you stay laser focused in those particular areas that you really want to support. Another opportunity may be cardiac service line growth. You want to bring in more cardiac patients, but then you can't get into interventional radiology. You can't recover patients in a timely manner because you need those nurses with a clinical expertise. And your nurse educator may be a jack of all trades, and you really need someone who really knows that particular clinical field. So that's why clinician reskilling is really an important factor, not just something you talk about, but something you have to do.
It's a great point. And I love the specificity, whether it's interventional radiology or, cardiac specific service line. And so this one kind of builds on, companies like ours and all of the tech enabled companies that are focused on staffing. So with the emergence of these companies, many of which rose during the pandemic and are now sort of post-pandemic finding their footing, with those healthcare workforce marketplaces and potentially partnerships with facilities, how can you leverage clinical reskilling as a strategic tool to attract and retain talent, potentially bolting together the tech-enabled recruiting engine of a company that functions as a workforce management solution, and have that ultimately benefit the organization's financial success as well?
One of the things I saw, especially during COVID, was from a clinical perspective. I spent the majority of my career in acute care, so it was fascinating to see how innovative a lot of the hospitals and health systems were with moving staff from ambulatory to critical care to being able to augment staffing where the need was, right? But the challenge with that is a lot of those nurses really wanted to stay. They really wanted to stay in those specialty areas, and those organizations just didn't have the bandwidth to train them so they could become competent in those areas. And what happened was those nurses went back to where they came, whether it was home health, whether it was long-term care, whether it was ambulatory, and then they start seeking out other opportunities, right? What reskilling does is a transition to practice model that extends beyond new grad residencies. And when you have a robust workforce marketplace that looks at all of the different arms, not just contingent labor, but looking at how do you maybe identify clinicians who are external to the acute care setting, who have a thirst, who have a want and desire to learn acute care. How do you recruit those folks who have the wherewithal to come in and learn because they have a want to learn, and they actually have that clinical background foundation where they know how to interact with patients, they know how to do fundamental patient care, but they need some of the augmentation. So when you have a really effective and robust reskilling program, you can have workforce marketplace partners that can help build your workforce, like looking at new grads. Maybe they can help bring people in who have no longer part of the new grad 2-year program, but they may be 3 years out who applied and couldn't get into the residency, and maybe can help vet some of those clinicians. There's just so many different ways. Looking at temp to perm, when you have a really effective clinician reskilling program, then you can really have a really solid bridge, not just someone who's going to come and go, but someone who's going to build with you and help you stabilize your workforce.
It sounds like the relationship between workforce marketplaces and these facilities is transitioning to something from like a client vendor model to more of a partnership, which can now include aspects of reskilling. So, and with this question, it's really, where does the alignment between clinician reskilling initiatives, which we've discussed, and the overall organizational goals play in optimizing financial outcomes?
Well, we talked about this a little bit, and this is kind of a short answer. It's really unlocking your strategic service line initiatives. How do you do that? And the best way to do that is through, working with your leadership team, identifying with your physician partners, where do you want to grow? Where do you want to go? Where are some of the challenges that you're experiencing or in your organization? And look at it from a competitive market advantage. Are you having delays in getting your surgery cases scheduled because you don't have enough OR nurses for your ortho cases? So do you need to have a clinical reskilling program around bringing in a clinical expert to train your staff to make sure they're not only competent because they came from somewhere else for a couple of months, but really proficient in those skills, not only with the skills, but now with your EMR, with your policies, understanding, having a relationship with your physicians, with your community resources. And when you have people internally who are trained, it makes the whole continuum of care a lot much smoother.
It's a great point. When I worked at Grady Hospital, we had a small reskilling initiative. This is way pre-pandemic. It's like 2014, 2015. And the clinical instructors even then would get pulled out of the training to get, because there was somebody had called out sick, and they would get pulled into the operating room. So it does highlight, if you've got, maybe you change the balance of who's external, and perhaps that's the focus on, the playing the role of reskilling instructor or preceptor, to ensure that the internal staff are dedicated to resources within, and it changes the balance of where you make investments. So, and alongside this, again, we're diving a little deeper into workforce marketplaces, but, how can clinician reskilling and upskilling transform internal staff into valuable assets, so that you equip them with skills that they're seeking, and then essentially enable them to be a greater asset to the facility?
Well, they have to be part of the solution, right? So right now, many times organizations, they are leveraging their internal resources as preceptors because they have to,
Right.
without any promise of advancement and things like that, because they just have to have them because that's where they are. They don't have enough staff for that.
Right.
But if you strategically identify clinicians who want to, for example, a good example is when you currently we have med-surg nurses who've expressed interest in transitioning to ICU.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it works, it kind of goes in phases, right? You can't just take those nurses out of med-surg and just plop them into ICU. Then what happens to med-surg? It gets decimated, which is probably the fear of every nurse manager in the med-surg department, always being cannibalized by those specialty units. But what you do strategically with a reskilling model, that's part of my research model, is you look at it as a whole. You look at it from the beginning to the end goal, and you identify those clinicians who want to reskill. They're part of the program that helps train their the people who are going to come behind them. They're new grads. So it's easy to recruit new grads. There are always new grads wanting to come in, but the problem is your institutional knowledge, your preceptors are moving up before you have a chance to train them. So it's really part of strategically moving in like educational project management that we don't always have a lot of bandwidth for. But if you bring those clinicians into the What's in it for me, it really sets you apart with having a model that takes you to another level, because now they're seeing their own potential, their growth and development, and it's tied to them providing education and support to people who are coming behind them. And then they know there's a model, there's succession planning, there's a transition plan, there's professional development. There isn't a threat of someone coming in taking their job away. Even in those union environments, that's a supportive piece of it, because now even the union supportive, because they're seeing that, hey, you're bringing in more clinicians that are internal to the organization. You're not just filling it with contingent labor that are coming in and out. So you're building the membership and providing additional support to their members, in addition to what you currently have in place. So it's just really symbiotic. It has to be a symbiotic relationship. You're always going to have a little bit of contingent labor, workforce, marketplace, even with your own internal resources. But because of the huge gaps and shortages in healthcare and staffing, you have to find a symbiotic relationship where you're putting the lion's share to your internal staff and growing and developing them and augmenting it with the resources you need to get them where they need to go.
That's a great point. In the very beginning, you mentioned it can't just be lip service. And I think this is it just highlights that, union leaders need to see and then feel that there's a true investment, in the clinicians and their membership to allow them to move up, to expand their income opportunities and their skill sets so that there's a greater, daily employee satisfaction. And they feel like they're expanding their capacity to provide clinical care. So, and along those lines, we've, say our members of our audience invest in a reskilling program. Your research comes out supporting the smartest ways to line it up with the right departments, depending on that particular, customize it to that facility. And now you've enabled them to, greater facilitate making their clinicians, strategic assets for them. They've got happier employees and they've invested in and benefited from that. So how does it impact both patient care and organizational prosperity looking forward?
So Jeff, I'm an operator. I like getting things done. And that's been kind of a challenge for me sometimes because, we talk so much, we attend a lot of meetings. We're trying to figure out how to solve this nursing shortage. But, when you look at transition to practice, you have to have a way using evidence-based practice to transition these clinicians into their specialty. But there's also a bit of project management that comes along with that, right? And one of the most challenging things for people to do is to execute. We all, know people who plan very well. They plan, they talk about it. They have lots of campaigns around things. But for me, one of the missing pieces that I've seen over the years is how are you going to execute it? So with the model that I'm researching, what I'm proposing, we're actually putting resources where they need to be. It's not consulting. It's actually looking at putting those clinical experts where they need to be with those clinicians to make sure they're reskilled appropriately and have the competencies they need to be able to provide excellent patient care.
Excellent. So I think on this side of it, it's again, expanding on that from how does upskilling transform from, it's an expenditure upfront, there's an investment, there's no question. And when and how, might you be able to say, and maybe this is going to be something that's going to come out in your research, which certainly we will find that way to share it with all of our listeners today and a broader audience. But when does it become revenue enhancing? And I think I could even think right away, some of it's from this service line growth that you spoke to. You're investing in there and it's a pretty clear line of sight. But along the lines of, as you've mentioned before, patient satisfaction, retention, where's the measurable parts, right? If our finance team is saying, where's the ROI? This sounds great, sounds smart, sounds like what should be happening. Where's the ROI for the facility?
Oh, like you said, reskilling is not free. It's not free. There's nothing that's free in this world. I tell you, so I live in Southern California and I had to get gas yesterday, and gas out here right now is $6.40 a gallon.
That's not
so that being said, you have to find the margin in everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with reskilling, it's an investment that actually probably provides a return on investment that's quicker than any piece of equipment, any type of consultant, any type of anything that you really pour into that sounds good, but you're just hoping, you're crossing your fingers, that gives you the outcomes you need. With an effective program that is rolled out the way I am anticipating it needs to be rolled out, you'll see a return on investment within the first 90 days. Probably more significant in the first 6 months, because you're looking strategically at what do you need, where do you need to potentially transition the proportion of contingent labor to your internal staff. Remember, you're taking clinicians that are already licensed with experience. It doesn't take 3 months to train an experienced nurse. So you're already starting that cycle of replacing some of your contingent labor with internal staff who really want to learn. You're backfilling with newer nurses who've been trained by your existing staff. So you're going to see that return on investment I don't even want to overpromise, but let me just say, you're going to see a significant return on investment with an effective reskilling program relatively quickly, and it'll be measurable.
Within the first year, maybe. Is that too strong?
Oh, of course. Oh, absolutely, in the first year. But you'll start to see parts of it early in the implementation of the process.
So maybe the goal of today's conversation is how do you make reskilling, which maybe it sounds like a mouthful, how do you make that the MRI or the robotic surgery investment of workforce management? When will reskilling have its day? Maybe it'll be after this webinar. We'll see. So one, thanks so much, Elena. I want to get us to some audience questions, and it looks like we've got a few that have come in. And I'm just this first one is clear that we have finance folks who are listening, which is great. Maybe skeptical. I think same as I said before. I think it sounds incredible. You've got obviously some data that you're going to share with us once you get further along in this project. Which is really in the next 2 months, which is exciting. But this first question is really more about it's touching on the ROI part of it, but how do you balance the upfront costs? So it's almost like they bought enough of what you had to say today. Now they're thinking about turning around to their hospital administrator and saying, look, it's going to cost me X thousands or tens of thousands. Here's an ROI. Maybe it's the first year with the information we have today. Maybe it's faster. But what's the long-term financial benefit for that organization?
Well, a long-term benefit is you're going to have staff who you will retain a little longer. So the research is out. There's a study by Health Impact. It's an organization out here in California. And actually, I've seen it in several other venues as well, where they're anticipating your nurses won't stay longer than 2 years, right? But when you reskill, it's like giving your staff a new job. They're
Mm-hmm.
getting an opportunity to
Love that.
go into a new specialty that expands their skill set, gets them into a different department with different coworkers, different physicians. And so where you may see like someone, especially some of the newer generation nurses come in and they may go into med surg or telemetry or whatever, and they're planning on leaving in a couple of years. If they know there's a pathway for professional development where they can go into their specialty of choice because there is a reskilling program, now it's like they have something to look forward to, where it may not be 2 years, it might be 3, right? I mean, the instant gratification world is here. So, they want to kind of get out, but you'll start to see more of a boomerang effect as well. You'll see those folks that you treated really well and trained, they'll want to come back when there's an opportunity for them to settle down and stay with the organization that they feel like they're a part of that invests in their future.
I love that. That reskilling is the new job at your current facility. It still feels, exciting, sexy. It's an opportunity to grow and expand as a clinician and provide a greater depth and breadth of clinical care, but you don't leave, which that is the long-term
And
benefit.
Jeff,
You
can I
don't
say
have
one
to
more
turn.
thing?
Sure.
You mentioned it earlier about your example from Grady, but one
Mhm.
of the reasons why programs a lot of times that are housed in organizations don't work well is because there isn't a supportive transition plan.
Yeah.
Usually it's an orientation, you have a checklist, and then you're kind of off on your own. And with a reskilling program, so I'm using the Bridges transition theory as part of my research, you have to be able to support these clinicians so that they continue to feel successful and a part beyond just the orientation piece of it.
Right.
And that's an important factor in making sure that your staff feel supported. They want to stay. They know they're not just going to be left out of the wolves once they have their checklist. And so that's the other piece of reskilling that we have to focus on, not just giving them the skills, but actually being there to have an effective transition to practice that supports them in their success in that particular unit.
Excellent. I agree. That makes sense. And so I've got another finance type question. It's pretty specific. So they want they want you to quantify, how can you quantify the potential savings that a robust reskilling or upskilling program can bring to a healthcare organization? And maybe there's a ratio. That's part of me thinking that was their question, but maybe it's if you're going to do 10, you invest in 10 to go from essentially potentially, maybe just med surg to tele, and that's probably a short training cycle. Where's the savings, and could you measure it based on a ratio of how many clinicians you're going to put through a program like that?
Yeah, let me think. So I love 10. 10 is always a round number. But as part of my research, I was looking at, of course, the cost and the ratio between your contingent travelers versus your full-time staff.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked at or when I looked at the staffing industry analysts, their data from 2021. If you look at, and let me look at the calculation, when you have like 10 travelers,
Mm-hmm.
and many organizations have more than 10 travelers. But if you look at just 10 travelers that you may have in a particular department, that's an expense of about 1.5 million a year, right? Which is pretty expensive. The rates have gone up. They've kind of flattened a little bit in the past year or so, but it hasn't really dropped a lot. And then when you look at the same for your full-time staff, looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the same 10 staff for the same patients costs about $712,000. And that delta and that savings, once you convert those contingent staffing clinicians to your internal staff, or you replace them with your reskilled clinicians, right? That's a savings of about $790,000 per 10 nurses that you reskill and have in those departments. And that adds up quickly. So for organizations that have 10, 20, 30 contingent nurses on
Or
site or more, right?
more, yeah.
You're going to have those folks who are going to be replacing, FMLA and things like that. That's a
Sure.
really responsible use of using your partners, your staffing partners for that. But
Right.
when you're like I've seen, like we've seen, facilities that are, staffing with 50-60%, contingent labor, it's not good for the facility financials. It's not good for the patients. It's not even good for the staff who are there and even the travelers, because they don't know what's going on. They're just kind of relying on what people are telling them. Sometimes the charge nurses have only been there a year. So there's just so many gaps, just that Swiss cheese effects that happen. But cost savings could easily be upwards of $750,000 to $800,000 per 10 nurses that you reskill as your internal staff.
That is way more specific than I thought we would get. So that's actually really exciting. Something that can, I think, help make the case when there's a choice to make that investment. So this next question, I'm sure it's a clinical leader. It's essentially, can you share instances? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. And so I'm certain we shouldn't be sharing the names, but we're an organization overlooked clinician reskilling as a financial strategy. And then if you know it, what was the potential impact on their competitive edge or their fiscal stability?
Well, let me just say, with this great group that's watching this webinar today, I'm sure no one falls into that category. I'm sure all of you have thought about it, which is what
These are
makes
the leaders.
your
These are the
interest,
innovators. They don't
right?
do that.
Right. But there are organizations where, even right now, probably September, so maybe a month or so ago, start strategically planning on how many travelers are going to hire for the winter, right? That is the strategy. We know that we're going to have a increase in flu patients or whatever. So the go-to strategy is automatically start planning for a winter surge. And that just means hiring X amount of travelers instead of, and like I said, because everyone's kind of been in reaction mode, thinking strategically around in the summertime when volume's low, summer volumes are there. How do you look at your internal staff? How do you have a workforce solutions partner to help you recruit if you're having a hard time finding people in your area, and then train them strategically so that when winter comes, instead of hiring, your 100% you're used to hiring, it may be down to 40% compared to what the year before. So those are some of the things you have to really look at strategically. And many organizations fall into that category where the default is always hire travelers,
Right.
hire travelers. And a lot of it is not because they don't want to look at other options, but because their internal resources don't allow for that level of support, right? When you're wanting to grow. I was talking to a colleague of mine and we were talking about pediatric surgeries, right? And you're thinking winter surge. Well, the surge for pediatric surgeries is in the summer when, kids are out of school, parents are off, things like that. So that's when they would need their travelers. So maybe they would do reskilling maybe in the winter months in preparation for the summer. So it's really about looking about 3 to 6 months out, looking at your trends, identifying where do you see the most growth, where do you want to grow, and how do you work with a program that will get you where you want to go, and just kind of strategically cut down on the automatic knee-jerk reaction of hiring contingent labor, because all you're doing is robbing Peter to pay Paul. The same travelers work for multiple agencies, and those clinicians are in a bidding war between those agencies of who's going to pay the most. It's not like there's like this, unlimited supply. It's kind of like trying to, squeeze water out of a rock. So, the goal is to increase capacity, increase the number of clinicians available so that they do know how to work in those particular fields instead of taking the same people and just moving them all over the place.
And retain them. Right.
Correct.
That's the critical piece of what I think you're offering with reskilling is that retention
Correct.
retention increases, turnover reduces. All right.
Correct.
So you've got time for two more. I'm going to take this one and then we're going to get to our last question and then we're going to wrap up here. But this question, I'm sure it's from a patient safety officer, potentially someone who's now thinking about taking this information from this webinar and talking to maybe the CFO at this facility. But they are asking for you to elaborate on the relationship between improved patient outcomes that result from clinician reskilling, as measurable as you can make that, and then the potential impact on the organization's bottom line.
Right. So it's about quality patient outcomes. It's about mitigating risk. When you have your entrenched staff, who's part of your internal staffing pool, they are going to know about your policies. They're going to know where resources are. They're going to know where your supplies are. They're going to know how to communicate between departments because they have those relationships. And that inherently increases quality and decreases risk or opportunity for risk. Now you understand your physicians, you know who they are, you know what they're used to, you know what their expectations are, you know the protocols and the orders that they typically write. And so you don't have as many gaps. So when you have a program with clinician reskilling that supports your internal staff, they are laser focused on making sure they are able to support your team, know what your quality metrics are. So if there's some documentation components that you may be struggling with, that's part of reskilling, right? When you have that clinical expert, not only teaching the skill, but teaching how to document it in the appropriate way, teaching, knowing when to proactively get in front of whatever that issue is, some best practices, and not just kind of flying by the seat of your pants, right? You have to have a strategic way of doing that takes people from not only the skill competency, but to the knowledge and supporting them in that way. So when you have that staff that's in your department and they really know what those goals are and your outcomes, your quality metrics are, you continue to build on that and you don't have that turnover of people coming in and out, and you're investing in your own staff and they want to be part of that success as well.
I love that. And so I really hope that this patient safety officer takes that back to their potentially their CFO or the CEO to share that. So this is our last question. I really appreciate having you on here today and the insight with what you've shared with us about what we're reskilling is taking workforce management. So this last question, I'm sure it's from an HR partner that's listening right now, and hopefully all our HR listeners can pay particular attention to this one. So it's back to workforce marketplaces. And you had just mentioned the bidding war that's between facilities, it's between agencies and a limited supply. How does reskilling give a healthcare organization a competitive edge when trying to acquire highly skilled professionals? And of course, the theme that threw out here, while simultaneously optimizing financial resources.
Jeff, I'm sure you can probably tell, and maybe by the folks on this presentation, I'm really passionate about reskilling. I really am. It's something I wish I had when I was in leadership in the acute care setting, because I was always scrambling, trying to figure out how I was going to get my folks oriented, how I could not take my best nurse all the time and take them out of staffing to go
Burn
and
them
train
out.
them. And so when you look at the just the evolving landscape and how everything's competitive, everyone's fighting for price and for attention and for cost reduction or whatever, you look at those, not just the dollar cost, but you look at the soft cost. You're seeing your decreased length of stay. When you have higher quality, the patients don't stay as long, right? You're starting to see that. You see increased retention. So all that money that's spent on recruiting for the same job over and over again, where you might be recruiting every year, it may end up being every other year, but it's still, it reduced that cost. You're decreasing your vacancy rate. So now you may have like a little bit more overtime, but that's okay because you have your staff who's familiar with the department. They may have to pick up a shift or two, but now you're a little bit more agile as far as knowing what your vacancy rate is, who you're training, who's staying, and how you're investing in your current staff. And then on the other side of the spectrum, on the patient care side, you're looking at improved patient outcomes. Because now you have staff who are trained appropriately according to your regulations, your expectations, your physician requirements and their needs. And then also the patient experience. Now you have people who are from the community, who understand the patient population. They're vested in making sure that their home hospital looks good, or healthcare facility or health system looks great, and they feel like they're part of that team that's pushing the organization forward, and they're successful as well, and they're a representation of that, and they realize that their organization has poured into them the resources and the skills they need to be successful as well.
Awesome. Well, I want to say again, thank you, Elena, for sharing so much about the research topic that's become the central part of your thesis. And we do hear it. I hear it, the passion that you have for reskilling and ultimately for improving, patient outcomes and optimizing patient care. So I want to say a huge thank you to you, as well as, of course, we have to thank Becker's for allowing us to host this podcast. And then finally, our listeners who have taken almost an hour out of their day. And if anything that we shared today, especially from Elena's project, results in improvement in patient care and better patient outcomes, and potentially rethinking, or at least now opening up their minds to the consideration of a reskilling program, please reach out to us. I'm sure Becker's can help facilitate the connection between our organization and any of the listeners here with any further questions or interest, or anything that we can be a resource to all of you. So once again, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you, Elena, for such fantastic insights on a topic that's really timely right now. I know I appreciated it. I'm sure our audience did as well. And we also would like to thank SnapNurse for sponsoring today's webinar. So to Jeff's point, please reach out with any additional questions. And if you'd like to learn more about the content presented today, you can always check out the resources section on your webinar console. And please be sure to fill out the post-webinar survey as well. So to our audience members, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.